The promise of family, a sacred pact forged in blood and shared history, sometimes turns out to be a mere contract, subject to the cold, hard logic of profit and loss. It was in the quiet, sun-drenched days of their Florida life that the call came, a voice strained by both distance and the brutal news of a cancer diagnosis. They lived in the kind of suburban bliss that only the Sunshine State could offer, where the days bled into one another in a haze of warmth and routine. He, a man not yet retired but living a life of flexible work, and his wife, a contractor whose projects dictated their physical location, had a comfortable existence. The rhythm of their lives was predictable, a gentle pulse of familiarity. The sister, his sister, a single lady who had never married or had children, lived her own life on the opposite coast in the sprawling, sometimes chaotic landscape of California. She had built a world of her own, a solitary existence that was, by all accounts, sufficient for her needs. They spoke on the phone, exchanged holiday cards, and maintained the kind of relationship that six biological siblings could have from a distance. But cancer, a word that carries the weight of an entire world in its six letters, changed the calculus of distance. The diagnosis was a thunderclap, a violent interruption to the gentle, humming rhythm of their lives in Florida. The news, delivered with the stark finality of a doctor's report, forced a decision that would unravel years of established routine and lead them into a courtroom to face the stern gaze of a judge. The Rileys, a couple whose life was built on movement and adaptability, saw the opportunity to combine their professional reality with their family obligation. His wife, a contractor, had work, and they moved around quite a bit. It was a lifestyle that afforded them a certain freedom, the ability to pack up their lives and start anew wherever the next project took them. And as fate, or perhaps a more pragmatic hand would have it, a new project materialized in California, a land they were both originally from. The timing seemed almost too perfect. They would leave their home in Florida, their established life and routines, and move to California. It was, as Mr. Riley would later present it, a monumental act of sacrifice, a giving up of their lives to come to the side of an ailing sister. It was a mission of mercy, a sacred duty. In the brightly lit, unforgiving crucible of the courtroom, the story began to fracture under the weight of a skeptical gaze. Judge Judy, a woman who had seen every possible permutation of human motivation, listened with an expression of polite incredulity. Riley stood before her, a man with a clear and straightforward complaint, a narrative of selfless devotion. But the words he used, the simple phrases that formed his account, did not align with the deeper currents that the judge sensed were at play. She began her questioning, her voice a sharp instrument cutting through the air, probing for the seams in his story. She asked if he was retired. No, he was not. Did he get a new job? He paused, and his wife's profession, that of a contractor, came to the forefront of the conversation. We move around quite a bit, he offered, as if this simple fact explained everything. It was an admission that subtly but fundamentally changed the narrative. The self-sacrificing act of giving up their lives in Florida to minister to an ill sister began to look more like a convenient confluence of events. The judge, her skepticism deepening, rephrased the situation in a way that stripped it of its emotional veneer. So you came to California and you had another project in California, she stated, not as a question, but as a definitive conclusion. He could only agree. Correct, he said, his voice now sounding less righteous and more resigned. The project was not a temporary one. It was ongoing still. This was the point where the entire foundation of his complaint began to crumble in the courtroom air. The judge, a master of a 1,000-yard stare, could feel the threads of the story pulling apart. She called his complaint sort of misleading. The phrase hung in the air, a final and damning judgment on the version of events he had submitted to the court. He had led her to believe that he and his wife had given up their life in Florida to come to California to minister to his ill sister. It was a noble, altruistic act, one worthy of sympathy, and consideration. He insisted it was very much true, even as the judge's words were eroding the very core of his claim. Now a new picture was emerging, one of a couple who had a contracting job that was still ongoing. A job they were still doing, even though his sister was no longer with them. The fact that they were originally from California was, as Judge Judy so pointedly put it, irrelevant. The crux of the matter was the motivation for the move. The judge had been misled. The complaint had been framed in such a way as to suggest that the move was purely a familial, emotional one, born of love and obligation. It now appeared to be a combination of both things, a convergence of professional convenience and personal duty. The Rileys had moved to California with a job, and they were still living there even after his sister had passed away. Riley could only confirm this with a simple yes. He tried to clarify, to explain the nuances of the situation, but his attempt was cut off. A voice from the sidelines, presumably a lawyer or a representative of the opposing party, offered a clipped explanation. "They still have work here." The judge, unwilling to cede control of her courtroom, shut down the comment immediately. "I didn't ask you a question." The tension in the room was palpable, a fragile, unspoken understanding that the truth was more complex than the simple narrative Riley had presented. But the caregiving was real. The sister had lived with them for a while, a single lady, never married, with no children. Of her 6 siblings, she had lived only with Riley. The other 5 were not physically close, a small but important detail in the context of her isolation in her final months. Riley had been her sole caregiver, the one who drove her to her doctor's appointments and did whatever had to be done to ensure her comfort and her care. This was a truth that was not in dispute. This was the work of family, the hard, unglamorous labor that love sometimes requires. He was her closest living relative, at least physically, and in a world where physical proximity can mean everything, he had answered the call. The sister who had spent her life as a single woman passed away. The time for caregiving was over. The time for reckoning had arrived. In the aftermath of her death, the estate had to be settled. All the sacrifices, all the doctor's appointments, all the quiet moments of companionship that had defined the Rileys' life in California seemed to point to a singular conclusion. They, as the ones who had been there at the end, would be the ones to inherit. They would be the ones to receive the legal and financial recognition of their devotion. The reality was a shock, a brutal, unceremonious betrayal. The sister, whose final months had been spent under their care, had left her entire estate to her cousin, a woman named Ms. Wells. The will, a final cold statement of her wishes, had bypassed Riley completely. His sacrifice, his move across the country, his tireless caregiving, all of it was, in the eyes of the law, unrewarded. The man who had been her closest living relative, who had given up his life in Florida to be with her in her final days, was left with nothing but his ongoing contracting job and the knowledge that his sister had, for reasons that were now lost to him, chosen a distant relative over him. The tension between Riley's tangible caregiving labor and his complete exclusion as a beneficiary in the will hung in the air, a final dramatic note that set the stage for what was to come next. In the immediate aftermath of the will's reading, a final cold statement of a life now ended, a new reality settled upon Mr. Riley. The shock of being entirely left out of the financial inheritance was a silent blow, but it was followed by a peculiar, almost cruel, twist of fate. His sister, in a final enigmatic act, had made him the trustee of her estate. It was, as Judge Judy would later describe it, a double whammy. He was not the beneficiary, not the one who would directly benefit from his months and years of caregiving, but he was entrusted with the management of the very money he was denied. It was a role of responsibility without reward, a mandate to shepherd funds for the benefit of another. He stood before the judge, trying to articulate the complex swirl of emotions that this role had provoked. He had been an active caregiver for his sister for months. Years he had corrected, a man who had driven her to countless doctor's appointments and tended to her needs during her final, agonizing battle with cancer. His devotion was not in question, yet his sister's final gesture was to entrust her estate to a cousin, Ms. Wells, and his own caregiving to an uncompensated duty. It was a subtle slap in the face when the judge, in her sharp, perceptive way, posited that this must have been irritating to both him and his wife. He was quick to deny it. "No, not really," he said, a strained, thin smile on his face. But the lie was transparent. He corrected himself immediately, as if the truth was a physical weight he could no longer hold. It was irritating, but not for the reasons you say. It was not monetarily driven. The court was a stage, and he was an actor trying to sell a performance of selfless grief and noble duty. He wanted the world to see him as a man who had cared for his sister out of pure love, untainted by the prospect of inheritance. And in a way that was true. He had cared for her. He had given up his life in Florida. He had been there for her when her other 6 siblings were not. But the surprise, the shock of the will, was a wound that refused to heal. He confessed it was a surprise, a word he repeated twice as if by saying it again, he could somehow explain the profound feeling of being unappreciated and misunderstood. The judge, however, saw through the words to the deeper currents of anger and resentment that pulsed beneath the surface. The acrimony between Mr. Riley and Miss Wells was, as the judge noted, ongoing. It was an open wound, a festering conflict that had begun the moment the will was read and the duties of the trust were laid bare. On one side stood Riley, a man who believed his time, sacrifice, and physical presence were a form of currency, a down payment on a legacy that was his by right of blood and proximity. On the other stood Miss Wells, the sole beneficiary, a cousin who was not physically present during the sister's illness, but who was now the rightful owner of her assets. Their conflict was a clash of two competing truths, the truth of emotional labor versus the truth of a legal document. Riley, in his role as trustee, had control over the purse strings. He was responsible for paying bills, managing accounts, and eventually turning over the funds to the rightful beneficiary. But his every action, every decision, was now viewed with suspicion by Ms. Wells. She did not like the way he was handling the trust, and in her mind he was dissipating the assets. The word was a poisoned dart, a direct accusation of mismanagement and waste. To Riley, it was a profound insult. He had been a dutiful son and brother for his entire life, and now he was being accused of squandering his own sister's money. The thought was maddening. He felt a deep sense of injustice. He had given so much, and now he was being questioned by a woman who had, in his eyes, given nothing. The bitterness of their conflict spilled into the courtroom, a visible manifestation of their months-long battle. He attempted to explain the situation from his perspective, how Ms. Wells had stripped me of my trustee duties, a phrase that carried with it the weight of his defeat. He felt he had been unfairly removed, that he was the victim of a power struggle initiated by a greedy beneficiary. He fired back at the judge, bringing up Miss Wells's alleged instability, noting that she had gone through 3 different attorneys in a span of 6 months. He believed this was evidence of her capriciousness, her inability to manage the affairs of the trust properly. He wanted the judge to see her as he saw her, an erratic opportunist who was trying to wrest control of the estate for her own selfish ends. But Judge Judy was unmoved. She cut him off with a definitive, "It doesn't matter." To her, the number of attorneys Ms. Wells hired was irrelevant. The core of the issue was simple. The beneficiary had a right to the money, and she had a right to decide how it was managed. Her words were a harsh, cold reality check. She saw Riley's frustration not as a sign of his devotion, but as a clear indication of his lingering bitterness over the will. He protested, claiming the fact of the attorneys mattered to me, but the judge dismissed his protestations with a simple, "Doesn't matter." And then in a moment of stunning clarity, she diagnosed the entirety of his emotional state. "Do you see? Thank you. What you're doing now is demonstrating just how irritated you still are." The words were a direct hit. He could not deny them. He had lost control for a moment, and his true feelings had bubbled to the surface. He felt a flush of embarrassment, a profound sense of being exposed. He quickly tried to retreat to a more sympathetic position, apologizing and claiming that he was still emotional about his sister's death. But the judge was having none of it. She was not a therapist, she was a judge. This case was not about grief, it was about money. It was about a legal document and the rights it bestowed. It was about the tangible, material reality of the estate. She laid out the logical, unsentimental truth. If he were truly just emotional about his sister's death, he would have accepted the will. He would have rationalized it, understanding that it was his sister's money to do with as she pleased. Perhaps she felt closer to Ms. Wells. Perhaps she believed Miss Wells needed the money more than he and his wife did, a couple who had an ongoing contracting job and a stable income. The possibilities were endless, and ultimately, they were irrelevant. The pain on Mr. Riley's face was real, a mixture of grief, anger, and a sense of profound misunderstanding. He had cared for his sister, had seen her through her final moments, and now, in the eyes of the law, his emotional labor was being equated with a simple financial disagreement. The judge's words were a bitter pill to swallow. When people pass away, she stated, and you, as a relative, don't think that you're getting the appropriate love from the deceased by way of monetary reward, it's irritating. It happens all the time, and you're not unusual for that. She was not anointing him as a martyr. She was simply stating a universal truth about human nature. He tried to protest one last time, to claim that this was not him, that he was not that kind of person, but his words were hollow. The judge had already rendered her verdict on his emotional state. His case was about money, about his dissatisfaction with the monetary reward, and nothing more. The conflict over the trust funds was only the beginning. The stripping of his trustee duties, whether by his own resignation or by Miss Wells's maneuvering, left a gaping void. He no longer had a legal purpose in his sister's affairs. He was no longer in a position of authority, but the trust was more than just a bank account. It was the physical embodiment of his sister's life, the condo she lived in, the possessions that filled her rooms, the memories that resided within its walls. As the legal battle over the trust money reached its crescendo, the fight for access to the physical property began to take shape. Riley's emotional connection to his sister's life, to the tangible remnants of her existence, now clashed with Miss Wells's legal claim to it all. The stage was set for a new and more personal conflict, a battle not just for money but for the right to a physical space and the memories it contained. The moment the conversation shifted from the abstract nature of a trust fund to the tangible reality of my sister's condo, a new kind of dread settled in. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about her life, the physical space she had inhabited, the objects she had chosen and cherished. The judge's words, delivered with a cool, detached precision, fell like ice. She found that there were certain things missing from the condo, Judge Judy said, and the accusation hung in the air, a silent but potent poison. The fact that the condo had been very much in dispute was the key, the legal shorthand for the emotional tug-of-war that had consumed us since my sister's passing. I had been there, in that space, in the final quiet aftermath of her life, and now my presence was being recontextualized as something sinister. Ms. Wells, the beneficiary, had finally gained access to the condo, a place she had no history with, no emotional connection to. And what did she do? She took an inventory, not of memories or sentiments, but of assets. She found things missing in her mind, and in a move that was as calculated as it was cruel, she had notified the insurance company. My mind raced trying to catch up with this new layer of betrayal, an insurance claim. It was such a cold, bureaucratic act, a sterile process designed to quantify loss with a dollar value. But for me, it was a searing personal insult. The judge's words continued to paint the scene, a portrait of a meticulous, vindictive hunt for perceived damages. A missing laptop, purposely damaged sleep number bed. The details were so specific, so precise that they felt like shrapnel, hitting me one by one. I wanted to scream, to protest, to pour out my side of the story, to explain that I would never, in a million years, damage my sister's things. This was a new low. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about my character. I felt my face flush, the blood pounding in my ears. I opened my mouth, a desperate need to defend myself bubbling up. I really want to speak to that, if you let me. But Judge Judy, a master of a carefully controlled narrative, silenced me with a calm, deliberate shh. Just a second. The sound of her shushing was a whip crack, a firm reminder of who held the power here. She continued to lay out the cold, procedural facts. Ms. Wells had filed a claim, and the insurance company, as they have to, had begun an investigation. They had called an adjuster. And then, the final and most devastating blow, the one that made my blood run cold. She had, in her meticulous pursuit, made a police report. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. This was an allegation of theft and vandalism. The stakes had been raised to a level I had not anticipated, and I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty what was coming next. My wife, unable to contain her outrage, leaned in to confirm the detail. Yes, indeed, she said, her voice laced with fury, and named me as culprit. The word culprit hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. It was a word reserved for criminals, for people who did malicious and deceitful things. It was a word that now, in this sterile courtroom, was tied to my name. My sister's cousin, a person who I had met for the first time in the wake of our shared grief, had gone to the police and accused me of a crime. The injustice of it all was a physical weight on my chest. I felt a wave of nausea, the room seeming to tilt on its axis. The accusation was so absurd, so far-fetched, that it was almost laughable, and yet here we were, in a court of law, discussing it as if it were a legitimate possibility. The judge, her eyes unblinking, turned to me. "Can I see a copy of that police report?" she asked. This was it, the moment of truth. The document was the thing, the physical evidence that held the accusation in its cold, black and white text. I had asked for it before. My mind replayed the phone calls, the emails, the frustration of being stonewalled. The report had been denied to me. I had to tell the judge the truth. "No, because I don't have a copy." It felt like a defeat, a public admission of my powerlessness. But then Ms. Wells, her voice laced with a smug, self-satisfied tone, chimed in. "Do you have a copy?" I asked her, and she, with a flick of her hand, confirmed that she did. "May I see it?" the judge demanded, her patience wearing thin. And then the moment that confirmed the depth of her vindictiveness, her desire not just to win, but to humiliate. She didn't just say she had a copy, she added a verbal punctuation mark, a final, unnecessary twist of the knife. "You were denied a copy." It was a small but significant act of cruelty. My wife, unable to stand idly by while I was publicly shamed, interjected, her voice sharp with indignation. I was denied a copy because I was the culprit. It was a direct violation of courtroom protocol, a raw expression of anger and frustration. And Judge Judy, in a move that was as swift and absolute as a bolt of lightning, brought her gavel down. No, not a gavel. It was the power of her voice, a single sharp command that sliced through the air. "Bird, put her out." The command was so sudden, so final that it took a moment to register. My wife, the woman who had stood by me for decades, who had moved across the country for family and for work, was being expelled from the courtroom. The judge's reasoning was as cold as her demeanor. "She's annoying me. She doesn't learn." The phrase echoed in my ears, a brutal assessment of my wife's behavior. "Not a free-for-all," she added, her voice dripping with contempt. "It's an out." The sight of Officer Bird, a man of quiet authority, moving toward my wife was surreal. It felt like an out-of-body experience. I was standing there, a man accused of a crime, watching as my wife was escorted from the room. It was a testament to the judge's absolute power, her ability to enforce her will with a simple command. My wife, initially resistant, her pride wounded, offered a final, defiant protest. "I beg your pardon." But it was useless. The judge was unmoved. "It's an outing," she repeated, her tone unwavering. My wife, realizing the futility of her protest, finally relented. "Pardon me, thank you." And then, in a moment of unexpected and almost unbelievable mercy, the judge stopped her. "Oh, you can stay." It was a reprieve, a small but significant moment of grace in an otherwise brutal exchange. My wife, humbled and quieted, offered a grateful, "Thank you, sorry, Your Honor." The tension in the room, which had been stretched to its breaking point, was now a taut, humming wire, waiting for the next snap. My lawyer, or perhaps a legal representative, stepped forward, a man who had been quiet until now. He held up a document. "Forgive me, Your Honor. Very difficult to find, but I do have it. Here it is." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the police report, the physical manifestation of the accusation, the document that would either prove my guilt or incompetence or the cousin's maliciousness. I watched as he handed it to Officer Bird, the paper a flimsy but powerful object of truth and lies. Bird, in turn, delivered it to the judge. I saw her hand, a steady, unwavering vessel of legal authority, take the report. The pages were a blur of words, a narrative I had not been allowed to see, a story I had not been allowed to tell. But now it was here on the judge's bench. The truth of the matter, at least in the eyes of the law, was about to be revealed. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The fate of my case, the very definition of my character, was now in the hands of a cold, impartial, and utterly unforgiving document. The words spilled from the judge's mouth, but they were not her own. They were the cold, dead language of a sheriff's department report, a document I had been denied, a narrative written to condemn me without a trial. I stood there, listening to her read its contents aloud, each phrase a blade turning in my gut. I had not seen this report. It was an invisible enemy, and Judge Judy, with her stern, unwavering voice, was its merciless conduit. She said she was going to tell me what it said, and I could only offer a hollow, "I appreciate that," the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The report, as she read it, began to construct a version of reality that was both familiar and alien. It said that Ms. Wells, Anna, had inherited the apartment from her deceased cousin. Prior to moving in, she had seen photos of the apartment and its contents through email exchanges. This was a crucial detail, one I had never been privy to. The report was painting a picture of premeditation, of a person who had planned her claim before she ever set foot inside the condo. It was a narrative of a careful, meticulous inventory, not a surprise discovery. And then came the date, May 26, 2016, a cold, specific marker in time. The report stated that Anna had moved to the apartment. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a frantic need to correct the record. I knew that date. I had a clear memory of that day, of that visit. It was not a move-in date. I blurted out, "Sorry, when?" And then, as she repeated the date, I couldn't contain myself. "Your Honor, may I correct that?" I was desperate to get the truth out, to expose the lie. I didn't move there. I was only walking. But Judge Judy was a force of nature, an immovable object in the path of my protest. She silenced me with a single sharp word. "Just, I'm reading. Listen to me. Don't correct anything." Her eyes, 2 points of cold steel, were fixed on me. "I'm reading to him what the police report says." She then turned her gaze to Ms. Wells, adding a biting footnote. "If it said something, and it wasn't accurate, you should have corrected it at the time." Ms. Wells, in a whisper, agreed. "Oh, yes." The report continued its cold, methodical destruction of my character. On May 26, 2016, Anna moved to the apartment. She looked around and inventoried the items in the apartment. The word inventoried was so clinical, so devoid of emotion. It was the language of a claims adjuster, not a grieving relative. She saw items were missing from the apartment that she had previously seen in photos. This was the crux of the accusation, the very heart of her claim. But the worst was yet to come. The report then named me explicitly. She believes another cousin of hers, Thomas Riley, who had access to the apartment prior to Anna's arrival, entered and damaged the mattress on the bed by cutting out a portion of it with an unknown object. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A surge of pure, unadulterated rage coursed through me. The image was grotesque, absurdly malicious. It painted me as a monster, a man who would defile his own sister's memory by vandalizing her most personal space. My voice, raw with emotion, broke through my composure. "She is lying." I couldn't help myself. I felt the judge's shushing finger, but I didn't care. The accusation was too vile to let stand. The report continued its litany of lies. She also believed I took various other items from the apartment. And then, in a stunning moment of self-preservation, the report undermined its own credibility. She does not know for certain if Thomas took the items or damaged the mattress. It was a legal hedge, a way to make the claim without committing to the accusation. She then added the real reason for her enmity. She stated she was in a battle with Thomas over being appointed trustee of her cousin's estate. It was a confession, a direct link between the legal battle and the insurance claim. The report's final lines were the most manipulative of all. Anna did not desire prosecution and did not want Thomas contacted over the matter. She was portraying herself as a merciful victim, a woman who, despite my alleged crimes, was willing to let me off the hook. She then added the final poisonous detail. She stated Thomas is emotionally unstable and did not want to aggravate him. I laughed, a bitter, cynical sound that came from the depths of my soul. Yeah, right. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to protect her claim. The report concluded with the real purpose of the whole exercise. Anna wanted the matter documented for insurance purposes. And my response, I'll bet she did, was a summary of my entire emotional state I saw through her game. The judge shushed me again. You don't have to, she said, her voice now softer, more thoughtful. I'm formulating a picture. Do you understand? And in that moment, the entire legal landscape shifted. My world, which had been turned upside down, was now righting itself. The judge had seen through the facade. She had read the report, and instead of seeing a grieving relative and a greedy thief, she had seen something else entirely. She had seen a person who had made a series of calculated decisions for a financial gain. And as very often happens in a legal landscape, the landscape is changing, Mr. Riley, she said, her voice now a calm, steady stream of clarity. And it's changing in your favor, sir. The words were a profound relief, a quiet vindication that spoke louder than any of my protests. She turned her attention from me to Miss Wells. Now you've got a windfall, she declared, her tone now sharp, accusatory. She had a new narrative in her head, and it was one of deceit and greed. She looked at Ms. Wells with a quiet contempt, a woman who had seen the inheritance of an apartment and a few possessions as an opportunity for a double payout. If it had happened to me, the judge said, I wouldn't have looked at draperies. And then she began to list them, the items and their absurd dollar values, a litany of petty theft that now took on a new shocking significance. 2 sets, 92 inches, $650. Sleep number bed, king size, model 1, $6,000. Moen brand shower heads, $2,000. A Galaxy Pro tab. Dishes, $350. Bissell Pro Heat steam for the floor. White bleach cruiser bicycle. A purse for $1,000. The list was a testament to her greed. A carefully compiled inventory of her supposed losses. The numbers were so large, the items so specific, that they revealed a mind preoccupied with a transactional view of life and death. The sleep number bed, at a staggering $6,000, was the centerpiece of the fraud, the most expensive single item on the list. The judge, her voice now a cold hammer, delivered the final crushing blow. How much in total did you get from the insurance company? Mrs. Wells, her defiance gone, was now a small, shrunken figure. Her voice was a bare whisper. $16,000, Your Honor. The number hung in the air, a testament to her successful scam. The judge repeated it as if to make sure everyone in the room heard it. $16,000. My wife, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke, a simple, disbelieving, "Ain't that all?" The judge, her eyes fixed on Ms. Wells, delivered the final undeniable truth. None of which actually you paid for. And Ms. Wells, with the full weight of her fraudulent claim now exposed, could only utter a single quiet word. Correct. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. My sister's possessions, the things she had purchased with her own money, were now the basis for a scam, a windfall for her cousin, a woman who had done nothing to earn it. The sleep number bed was no longer just a bed. It was a symbol of betrayal, of a legal and ethical conflict of interest that had turned into a money-making opportunity. The fact that the most expensive item was a bed with a portion cut out of it was a detail too precise, too perfect to be anything but a manufactured lie. And the date, May 26, 2016, with its claim of a move-in, was the final piece of the puzzle. I had been there. I had a specific memory of that day, and it had nothing to do with a move. The tension in the room, which had been about my grief and my anger, was now about her fraud. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold as the report itself, that my vindication was just beginning. The silence that followed her statement was not empty. It was a living thing, heavy with the weight of her authority. and you gained access to the apartment in May of 2016. The words were a direct quote from the police report, the cold, bureaucratic language of her document, which now, in this moment, felt like a noose. The report said Anna moved to the apartment in May. I knew the truth, a truth I had desperately tried to articulate, and now, finally, the date had been spoken aloud by the one person whose words truly mattered. I saw Ms. Wells's mouth open, her mind scrambling for an answer. She wasn't just a beneficiary or a claimant anymore. She was a witness on the stand, and she had just been caught in a lie. June 24th, she began, her voice a small, wavering thing. My heart leaped. She was trying to correct the record, but to change the date, but it was already too late. I saw the look on Judge Judy's face, a flicker of something that was not anger, but a profound, weary contempt. She had seen this before. It was a familiar pattern, the desperate, flailing attempt to patch a hole in a sinking ship. What? The judge asked, her voice a low rumble. Your Honor, was the first time I was ever at the apartment, Ms. Wells finished, her voice gaining a hint of desperate defiance. She was trying to change a foundational fact, to rewrite a police report in a courtroom. It was a fool's errand. The judge repeated the new date, June 24th, her voice slow and deliberate, as if she were marking it down on a mental chalkboard. And then, the final crushing blow, the diagnosis that was not just for the case, but for Ms. Wells's entire character. This is my problem with you, the judge said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. It was a statement of finality, a door slamming shut. Ms. Wells, still trying to salvage her lie, still clinging to the idea that she could explain her way out of this, tried to speak. No, I can explain the dates. But the judge was not having it. No, you can't. The words were a verdict, a condemnation. There was no way to explain a month-long discrepancy between a police report filed for an insurance claim and the truth. A claim based on what was supposedly seen and documented in May, when she, by her own admission, was not even there. The entire legal landscape, which had already changed in my favor, had now shifted completely, solidifying into a new, unassailable truth. The room fell silent. Ms. Wells stood there, a living embodiment of a lie caught in the unforgiving light of a courtroom. Her head was down, her body language a testament to her defeat. The fight was over. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the sleep number bed or the missing laptop. It was about credibility. It was about a document and the truth it both held and concealed. She had used a police report to document a falsehood for an insurance claim, and in doing so she had documented her own greed and deceit for the record. The irony of it all was a sharp, bitter pill to swallow. I had spent months trying to clear my name, to fight a ghost of an accusation, and in a single moment, a single utterance, she had done the job for me. Judge Judy looked at the two of us, a study in contrast. I, a man whose character had been publicly and maliciously slandered, and she, a woman who, in her own hubris, had used the very system meant to protect her to expose her own fraud. The judge didn't need to say another word. The truth, in its own silent, devastating way, had already rendered its verdict. The case was no longer about a dispute over a trust. It was about a claim of fraud and the emotional instability of the person who had been proven to have no integrity. She would find in my favor, of course. The case was so clear now, so black and white, that any other decision would be an absurdity. The legal system, for all its complexities and its flaws, had done its job. It had cut through the lies, the manipulations, and the false narratives to find the simple, painful truth at its core. And as I stood there watching Ms. Wells finally break down, the weight of the last few months began to lift. The anger, the frustration, the deep sense of injustice, it was all still there, but it was no longer a heavy, unmanageable burden. It was simply a part of my story, a chapter that had now been closed. The battle for my reputation had been won, not with a legal argument or a powerful speech, but with a simple, cold, undeniable fact: the date of a police report. It was a testament to the power of truth and the utter fragility of a lie. The trust, the one my sister had given me in her final act, the one Ms. Wells had tried to strip me of, was now, in a strange and roundabout way, finally restored. The court had not just ruled on a case, it had, in its own way, ruled on the very nature of belief, and it had found that in the end, truth always prevails.